Museum. On behalf of our board, I welcome you, and also on behalf of our collaborator, Godine, which is our bookstore in town, which is a wonderful bookstore. We have a member of Bookends at the back who, at the end, there'll be some book signing or selling books. Right now, if you want to do it, correct? Whatever. David said he didn't want to use the microphone, but I think our ceilings are just so high, it scoops up all the sound. I hope he does use it for you. In the material that David sent me a quote from the Cincinnati Enquirer that said, "Thank God some publishers, such as David R. Godine, march to a different drummer." And everybody I've ever heard of that speaks of David talks of him in this way, that he's a marvelous speaker and a maverick, and does something different. And I'm really honored that he agreed to come here to the Griffin tonight. David R. Godine produces 20 to 30 titles per year, and they do an active reprint program. I'm sure you wouldn't be here if you hadn't heard about David Godine. How many never heard of him before? There's a few, but not too many. The books that he publishes really speaks to his interests and to his dynamic, and they're wonderful, wonderful, wonderful books. Each book is an art piece in and of itself. And there's a wonderful collection at the back of the room and in our gift shop if you would like to browse through them. Mr. Godine has degrees from Dartmouth and Harvard. He's the founder and president of David R. Godine, and it was founded in 1970. He opened a print shop in a deserted barn in Brookline. He tells me he no longer lives in Brookline, he lives in Milton, and I wondered if he still prints his own books. I hear he does printing, and he's still doing letterpress. Not necessarily books, but done some invitations. I have a printing background, and let me tell you that the fact that he does letterpress is a pretty dynamic event. The early volumes of books that he did himself are collector's items. Do we have any of those here today, David?
No. In my trunk.
In your trunk. Well, I leave it to David to tell you the rest of the story, and I hope you all will help me welcome Mr. David Godine.
I will try this. How many of you is this your first time in Winchester? Yeah. You have trouble finding it? Yeah. I'm going to show you slides of some books we've done, but I want to talk a little bit at the beginning about process, because what you're seeing tonight, photographic books, are of course not the real things. They're simulacra of the real thing. They are reproductions of the real things. The real things, as those of you who take photographs know, are continuous tone prints that go from white to black with an entire grayscale in the middle. And what we've tried to do, what good printers try to do, is to imitate that as closely as possible. But it is, of necessity, nothing more than an imitation. My son spends a lot of time in front of this computer screen, and you know, now you can bring up everything from the Gutenberg Bible to Aldine Octavos to the Byrne Euclid. And he writes about them as if they're the real thing. And I say, you know, Addison, frequently the real thing is down in my library. You could actually look at it. But to him, what he sees on the screen is the real thing. And the problem with the computers today, in a way with printing, is you know what you see, you know what you have, but you don't necessarily know what you don't have. You don't know what's being left out of the process. And the process here is a very interesting process. I think in the history of graphic art, the 50 years, the first 50 years were always the greatest. The first 50 years of printing, starting with the Gutenberg Bible, Some people think it began with the Gutenberg Bible and it was downhill from there. And if you looked at the Bible, I mean, especially a copy in vellum, it really is a miracle of technology, considering it was the first one ever done. And this was true of aquatint, it was true of lithography, it was true of chromolithography. It was true of almost every process except the one used to reproduce photographs. This is the only process I know of where it took 100 years really to get up to speed. Because really what you're seeing are little dots on a piece of paper. If you look through a magnifying glass, you'll see the little dots. And where there is white on the piece of paper, there are very small dots. And where there's black on the piece of paper, there are very big dots. But it's still all photographed through a screen. And we were lucky because we came along in the 70s, really right after the Meriden Gravure Company, working I think with Kodak, had developed a way that would substitute for collotype, which is what they'd done up till then, which is a collodion process, a wet plate process on a plate, but a process which is murder to reproduce. It's very hard to print the same book from a glass plate twice because the emulsion will expand or will contract depending on the temperature, the humidity, the building, whether you're chewing gum. I mean, all sorts of factors will affect the plate. And so Meriden in the 60s really began thinking about how can we reproduce fine art, including photographs, in a way that we can reproduce. We can do it again. We can have a second printing without losing any quality. And what they worked out with Kodak was a way of shooting artwork through a screen of 300 dpi, 300 dots per square inch, fairly fine line. And then what they developed a little bit later with Richard Benson was real duotone. And real duotone is not shooting the same print twice through this fine screen, but shooting the same print twice at different angles. The first being straight down, so you really get all the blacks, all the whites, but you have very high contrast. And the second shot being at a 30-degree angle, so that you really pick up, if you will, the shadow tones, the mid-tones. And by, in a way, sandwiching those two plates, by printing them separately in two different colors, ergo duotone, you really came out with as close to the original as you possibly could. I remember when my wife and I were married, we decided that we'd spend our honeymoon in Newport. Newport sounded fairly romantic, and we'd visit Richard Benson. And Richard Benson was then working on his reproductions, I think one of the great photo books done in the last century, of the Gilman paper collection, which was sold at Sotheby's, I think, 5 years ago. And Benson had this Heidelberg in his basement, and he had this array of submarine batteries, which meant from me to you, there were like 9 submarine batteries. And I asked him, why aren't you just plugging into the wall? And he said, well, that current sort of fluctuates, but by having direct current off the marine batteries, I can absolutely regulate the current, therefore I can regulate the revolutions of the press. And then he had this big diesel generator where he could charge his submarine batteries. And then the best thing he did was he ran the generator and you could feed the juice back into the system and you could see the electric meter going backwards. He said, it's money in the bank. But what he was running those sheets through the press, I think 5, 6, and 7 times. Sometimes a single color that he shot at an oblique angle so that everything from the Fox Talbots that they own through the Harry Callahans were reproduced as perfectly as possible. And then he was doing them all in different papers. So every print in that book was printed differently from different inks and on different papers. It's extraordinary. It's an amazing book, but it is still, I would come back to, an imitation of the original, which is the continuous tone print. The great things about these books, I think, are not only that you learn a lot about history, but you meet some very interesting people on the way. The people who take photographs tend to be fanatics, eccentrics. I mean, they're not normal people. And we love them for that. And we always really knew quite quickly, I think there wasn't a lot of discussion at Godine about which ones we wanted to publish. Sometimes they waited years to have the book actually published, but there was no question that we would do them. And I thought tonight I'd just take you through, if I can work this computer, some of the ones we did. But I'll say the very first one you'll see was Arnold Newman. And if you look around at Harvey Stein's photographs here, you'll see the similarity. Newman was really our first major photographic book, and it was his first book too. And he was the first and best known of what's come to be known as the environmental photographer, the person who actually put his subject in the milieu in which they worked. So that Stravinsky's, you'll see, was right in front of his grand piano. Picasso was in his studio. Look around at Harvey Stein's photographs, you'll see that Newman's tradition is carried on vigorously. But when Newman was doing this, this was brand new. The Karsh book, which is the last book we did, Karsh never put his people, for the most part, in any environment which would tell you what kind of a person they were and in what milieu and situation they actually worked. So with that, the lights, and I'll just blabber on for half an hour, and you'll have refreshments and you can spend all your money. So this is all I have to do, just press this one. Can you all see this?
Down or over?
Okay. Yeah. This one right here? Forward?
Down.
This is cool. Okay. So this was the first really important book we did. And I guess you recognize these people, except maybe Ben Gurion, who's in the middle. I find that O'Keeffe and Stieglitz picture very interesting because there's such an obvious disconnect between the two of them. O'Keeffe is looking off this way, Stieglitz is looking right at you. And the Picasso photograph, I think, is quite famous. We set this book, believe it or not, most of these early books were set in hot metal. This was set in Optima. And it was the first book we ever set in sans serif type. And this is, I think, the first time, can you hear me okay? I'm not speaking to the microphone, trust me.
Thanks, Steve.
This was the first time that an actual test strip had been reproduced in a book. And of course, this is how most photographers work. They don't take a single photograph of the subject. They take multiple photographs of the subject, and then they check off the ones that they like. And then they weed that down. So the next page, we had it weeded down to the 4 that Arnold really liked of Stravinsky, and then finally the one that he printed. There you see environmental photography at its best. There's Picasso sitting in his studio, and Brock with a Brockian sketch right behind him. Well, everyone knows this book. This is Elsa's great book. Elsa ran a sort of a home for needy poets, artists. They came to her Cambridge house. They'd stay for days, weeks, months. She had everyone from, Creeley, Ginsberg, Ferlinghetti. And this was before they were household names. And Ilsa knew them all. So before she was out there photographing with her huge Polaroid, she was taking really snapshots in her house. I hope there's a picture of Harvey in there. But that's Creeley, that's Ginsberg. Ilsa, who's in the bottom? And Ferlinghetti over here. It's a delightful book because it's very informal. It's the only book I think that Lance Heidi ever designed for us. He also designed the one you saw before. It was totally informal. We did it in a single color at Eastern Press. Here's a spread showing Ferlinghetti with John Carney, wasn't it? Carney, who was the previous owner of the Broder bookstore. He founded the Broder bookstore. I think that must have been in the Broder bookstore. And there's Creeley and who was it? Robert Duncan. in Ilse's kitchen. You're still all welcome to stay at Ilse's house. I mean, it's still open territory as far as I know. This was Stephen Guy and Wilson's. This was the last active Shaker community still going in America. It's up at Sabbath Day Lake. I think there are 5 living Shakers still there. He did this 20 years, 30 years ago, so there were, I think, 7 at that time. And they were just beautiful shots, not only of the sisters, but of a very pure and simple architecture. This is still open to the public. You can still go. It's right down from the people of Poland Springs Water, same road. Kip was then working at Arthur D. Little, and I remember this book very fondly because Kip is the only photographer I remember who came in being employed by Arthur D. Little, where he had every possible scenario of the book worked out. The cost, the paper, the binding, how many copies we were likely to sell, what the profit margin would be, how long it would take us to make a profit. It was all there in black and white. All we had to do was pay for the book. I mean, everything else had been done. And I don't think he did a book after this, but it's still one of my favorites. And I can't remember when we printed this, but we definitely did it in Duotone. This was one of the spreads. It was all still lives. It wasn't, I remember, a human being in the entire book. But beautifully done. This, I think, was the first book we did with Rosie, but maybe Half-Life preceded it, I'm not sure. This was a small book. It's only, maybe 7 by 7. And we printed it at Steinauer. And Rocky, I think, wisely talked me into doing the cover like this. It was stamped in buckram with the inlaid portrait and then covered with mylar. And if you look at how tattered your dust jackets get in these books, unless you protect them, this is really a wonderful way to do a book, and I think it's a very elegant little book, really one of the most beautiful little books we've ever done. This was one of the spreads from it. And the duotone color, the gray, I don't know if you can see it, but it forms the frame around it, and then there's a slight line around the actual photograph, which again is printed in the gray and the black. This we did with a corker. It was the first major book in Bravo. It was a great Mexican photographer. They had a terrific show. We did not design this book. But we did the photographs again at Maryland. It still is, I think, one of the most beautiful collections of Bravo images that's been put together. And later we reprinted the book and we did actually an edition in Spanish of it because it was very, very popular, obviously, in South America. Really one of South America's great photographers. We've done a lot of books with Bobby Northleaf. She was then sort of leading the charge of the Carpenter Center, which was teaching photography for, I guess, the first time in the history of photography. And Bobby was the go-to person at the Carpenter Center. And she put together a number of books, this one about a country fair and great moments in everyday life. And I think that was a great moment. And this was a great moment, which was sort of the traveling edition of the Lampoon Show from that year, the National Lampoon Show, which went all over. But the portraits of the people, this is Bobby's own photography, were absolutely terrific, I thought. I think she's a wonderful social historian, still with us. This was a really important book, and I wish we still had this book in print. It was done by Steve Dunlop, who's here tonight. And it was the history of the New England textile mills. And it was not only beautifully put together by Doc, it was a very complex book to do because we had line engravings, we had Steve's own photographs, one of which you see there. These were the dwindling, dying days of what was left, as he said, the carcass of the New England textile industry. And he was very fortunate to get there, I think probably in the last decade when this could be done, when the mills of Lawrence and Lowell were still sort of operative. But it was the whole history, going all the way back to Pawtucket, Rhode Island, how it began, what a huge part, of course, it played in the New England economy, especially during the Civil War years, when these mills basically manufactured cloth not only for the North, but also for the South. I wish I had a spread, but this is actually in perpetual, but the book was set on linotype something. I can't remember what, but it was one of the last books we did. It was actually put together with glue. Do you remember rubber cement? And you cut it out, and you put it in a board, and you shot the board. And this whole book was done like this, and it was very, very complicated. There were many, many moving parts in it, if you will, and put together very well by the designer Bob Dothert from Vermont. This was Janet Malcolm's first book. Most of you know her probably as a cataloger of the history of psychoanalysts in the New Yorker. But when she began writing for the New Yorker, before she got embedded in the sort of the disputes of the mentally disturbed, she was their photographic critic, and she wrote wonderful essays for the magazine on the shows and the museum shows in New York. And Katie Holman's Diana is called, we'll come back to Diana, but Diana is a cheap kind of camera. It's made of plastic. It has a plastic lens. It's the most inexpensive camera you can buy. And what she was trying to say there, which of course nobody would get, everyone thought it was a book about Greek mythology, but it was really a book about expensive photography and cheap photography, something you could do with, as it were, a Kodak Brownie. And I think there's one spread here. This is the chapter on Avedon with this great, I don't know if you saw the Avedon show at the NFA. It was a wonderful show last month. So this was the chapter on Avedon, and this was the chapter on Irving Penn, who just died. And I remember we printed this book with Mercantile Printing. It was one of the first books we did with Mercantile. Aren't you glad it isn't symphony? Just me. I've done that. As I say, this was either Rosie's second book or her first book. I can't remember, but I loved it. It was Rosie at her sort of mysterious and geologically and ontologically and chemically and organically involved best. The images, I think, both mysterious and compelling and historically accurate and manipulated, but you wouldn't necessarily know it. Very well printed. I believe we did this at Acme. These were the days, you know, when Boston was really, I don't know if it was the home of photographic printing, but we had New York Graphic Society here. They were doing great books, Nancy Adams. Us, you had Acme printing, and above all, you had Edward Land and Polaroid. And Polaroid was really the driving force between, or behind good reproduction at Acme with Fran Canzano. And they did absolutely beautiful books. And Land really knew the difference. Land only made one great mistake in his life. He never saw what would happen with a computer chip. He really believed in silver nitrate. And I remember we did his annual report for 3 years, and you were on for the entire month of April. I mean, he would call you at 2 o'clock in the morning and have to go over and discuss the layout of the grammar. He never worried about security. That I will tell you. He could care less about A, marketing, and B, security. But he was really a fascinating guy, one of the real geniuses I've met. And I remember he had this amazing Alexander Gardner photograph behind his, that Gardner had done with a large format glass plate camera. And this was just when, I don't know whether desktop computers had come in, but certainly computers were on the horizon. And I remember asking him, I said, Dr. Land, don't you think that someday a computer's going to be able to do or reproduce, you know, what chemistry does today? Because Land was trained really as a chemist. And he said, no, because nobody will ever be able to fit as much information into a square inch of material as silver nitrate can when he did the garden. And of course, he was dead wrong. He was right for his time, but he was wrong for posterity, because 10 years later, of course, computers and computer chips could fit that kind of information in, which is why, alas, there's no more Polaroid. This was Estelle Juslin's book on the photographer. He was a visionary, he was a mystic. That's him, when you'll see him soon up on the cross, dying like Christ. But he was very important. Hollanday were one of the great sort of fantasy publishers that came out of Boston, Copeland and Day. And Day was the day of Copeland and Day. And they were the American counterparts, really, of John Lane and the Yellow Book and Aubrey Beardsley, and that somewhat threatening sensuality that was emanating from England, that was really brought to America by Day, who was born rich, died fairly rich, and spent his money publishing very beautiful and important books, but was also really an important photographer. And here you see him sort of up on the cross, imitating. I don't know how he did this, but Estelle figured it out. Many books have been done on Day since that, because he was such a real seminal figure in pictorial photography, that era when it was Casimir and it was soft focus, and Day and Casimir were good friends. But this was really the first book on him that came out. This was the first photographer who developed the negatives. No. What's his name? Oh, come on. He was English. He developed the photography.
Fox Talbot?
Yes, Henry Fox Talbot. Thank you, by Estelle Justin. And these were the first images that were ever printed in color. And of course, Fox Talbot's invention wasn't necessarily photography. It was the negative. It was the ability to take an intermediary transfix, if you will, and be able, in reverse, to reproduce a positive from it. Daguerre had invented, obviously, the daguerreotype. But that was the metal. It was a one-off thing. You couldn't reproduce it. What Fox Talbot really, there at Tinton Abbey, where he worked, was how to develop a negative so that you could then make a duplicate and a triplicate. And also how you could dye it in various colors, and you basically could have color printing for the first time. So he never got a patent for this. He was really one of those inspired amateurs like Julia Fox Cameron, and the English produced them by the score. But really, modern photography begins with Henry Fox Talbot. This was Sally Mann before she went sort of through her Southern Gothic Edgar Allan Poe phase. Was really a sweet little girl with a very large bust who came and visited us and showed me this wonderful series of photographs. You can see sort of the prepubescent fascination she had even then. But this was Sally's first book. And we actually had an option in her second book, the one of the 13-year-old girls, which I found made me squirm so much when I looked at them that I declined it. And of course, Aperture went on to sell thousands of copies. But this again was done at Mercantile. And we did it in two different papers, I remember. One was a gloss paper. This was on the gloss paper. And then she had done a series of collotypes, really beautiful collotypes, abstract collotypes. And we did that in an uncoated paper. And let's see if I can go back. And we bound it. This was the first time we bound what was called flexi-bound. It was a way that we could do, in a way, a paperback, but not with the edges trimmed flush. They actually had overhangs to them. Of course, these books got destroyed. I mean, this was probably 14 inches by 14 inches. There was no way that the book wasn't destroyed in the shelves, unfortunately. I should have learned my lessons that doing these oversized books is really very, very difficult. A, to sell them, and above all, to resell them. You know, people will buy them once, but they'll hardly ever buy them twice. I'm talking about a bookstore. They're just too big for the shelves. But we didn't know any better, and neither did Sally, so that's what happened. We developed a series of books. I remember talking to Rodney Stanow. We really wanted to continue doing photographic books. And everybody then was printing on 35-inch presses. That was the norm. Maybe a 40-inch press, 25, 38 sheet. So we developed this size called Imago Mundi, which was, I remember, 9 7/8 by 8 5/8 inches. You could take a 25, 38 sheet, you could fold it, print it in sixes, and come out with this format. We've done about 9 or 10 books in this format using that sheet size. I think once you go over a 25, 38 sheet, the pressman really has trouble looking at what he has to look at as these sheets are coming out 3,000 sheets per hour. It's hard to keep track. And when you're printing 8 or 10 or 12 up or 12 up, you just can't see everything you need to see. So this to us, 6 up was the max that the average pressman could really keep track of and keep quality control of, if you will. Arthur Leipzig had been taking pictures in New York for 40 years. I loved his work. He never had a book done. And, let's see. It's frozen. It's frozen in time. Yeah, I probably can. She's going to fix it. There we go.
And now we should recognize.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
You're welcome.
So this is LaGuardia, his birthday. I mean, what a picture of a politician. Everybody's happy. Yeah. Look at the hairdos. This must have been like in the 44, my birthday. 1944. This was, I love this book. We still have this book in stock. We have a lot of these books in stock. But this was the Naughton studio. It was the great Montreal studio. And they had offices in Boston, they had offices in New York, they had offices in Toronto. And in the States, they really concentrated on the campuses. Harvard, they took pictures of Dartmouth, they took pictures of Yale. They took pictures of visiting dignitaries like Emerson and Longfellow. It's a big book. It's probably 16 inches high and 12 inches wide. And we did this, I think, stupidly single color at Meriden, or Steinauer. We really should have done this duotone. And here you see one of their, they were famous for doing these composite photographs where they would basically seat, this is Yale, not Dartmouth, they'd seat the students, and then every year they'd go down and they'd take the class picture. And of course they'd cut out the head, and then they'd just stick the head on. It didn't matter because you were all dressed the same way. You see the same picture year after year with different heads on. Very, very clever, I thought. Someone's gesticulating there. Okay, remember the Diana Knight camera? Well, this was a series of photographs, same format as before, the Imago Mundi format, that Eric Lindblom took in Florence with a Diana camera. And I was just blown away by them. I thought they were absolutely beautiful. And here we printed it in Italy with Martino Mardersteig. And you can, the quality was just stunning. I mean, this is a plastic lens. It's not even a glass lens. And you can see how beautiful the reproduction was. And I think the originals were. They had a real eye. This was one of my favorite books. It was a large format book that Harcourt did in the old days when we could do these books in gravure. And we found out from Ellen Hofer that she still had the original photographs. So we went to Hofer, and we got the permission from Pritchett, and we did a small paperback. It's only, maybe 6 by 9 inches, reproducing her images in duotone. That one and perceived being the second color here, giving it sort of that warm tinge. And shooting, again, not from the book, but from the original photographs. So we were really able to get wonderfully atmospheric pictures like this, and a reset text that anyone could afford. I still think it's one of the great books written about London. or at least London of the 1960s. This is one of my great failures. You know, we always have failures. I thought this book was terrific. Jonathan Williams was the president and the publisher of another small publisher called the Jargon Society. And he spent half his time in England, half his time in the hills of North Carolina. He photographed everybody. I mean, he photographed Rachmaninoff's grave. He'd been in the West Coast with people like Duncan and Creeley, had wonderful photographs of them. Here's his photograph of Ezra Pound taken in 1966 in Italy, after he was let out of St. Elizabeth's and he'd gone back to Italy. And I convinced Williams to write these brief, somewhat quirky, very eccentric biographies of the various photographers, which he did. I can't give this book. No, I sell it for $3 and nobody buys it. Trade in color. My warehouse manager says, when are you going to get rid of that palpable Elysium book? You know, some photographers we've been after for years to do a book with us, and Caponegro was always one of my favorites. Caponegro and George Tice, one of the few people who still have their own dark rooms, and they actually go in their basements, and they actually have trays of these arcane chemicals, and they dip things in it, and they have fixers and all this stuff. And I just loved his work. I thought it was remarkable. He's good friends with a lot of the photographers who really began in New England. His wife, Eleanor Caponegro, was a very good book designer in her own right. And when we got wind that the Portland Museum of Art was doing a major retrospective of Caponegro, he approached them and said, if we can do it in this format, the Imago format, the 9 7/8 by 8 5/8, we'll do the book and we'll do it right. And I think he was happy with the results. It was beautifully printed in Massachusetts, actually, and I think probably bound by Acme, right? I think Paul, pretty sure Paul did it on Acme. Really a lovely piece of print. Coming at the end, don't worry. Lotta Jacobi is another artist who emigrated from Germany. She lived in New Hampshire for a long time. There was a publisher in New England who did a very first book, but there was nothing in print about Lotta Jacobi, who was really an important photographer, not only of the German scene, but also of people like Einstein, Robert Frost, when she came to this country, of the theater. She really recorded many of the major figures. And so we got permission from the estate to do this little, we had another series, sort of pocket paragons, we call them, which are very small books, all bound in paper. And this was, I think, our 6th or our 7th pocket paragon. We've done one of Tice, who I think I come to now. No, this is David Travis. Does that mean anything to any of you? He was till very recently the director of the Art Institute of Chicago, the Department of Photography, and a wonderful essayist. His main subjects were the French photographers. Guano, he did a great book on. Versailles, he did a great book on. And we suggested that we collect these essays in a book, which of course never sell because essays never do sell. But it was a terrific book. Here's his one in Paul Strand, for which she wrote the introduction to the big book that I think Harper printed. Very literate writer, very thoughtful writer, and someone who brought us probably the biggest book we've ever done. This was Rosamund's book. She collected photographs, but they just weren't any photographs. They were what we call full-tone postcards. And full tone were not what I was talking about, little dots on a piece of paper. They were actually photographs that were printed as photographs and sent out as postcards. So when you got a full tone postcard, you actually got an original print. It was full tone, just the way the name implies. And the book was divided into sections, and this was a section on sort of ceremonies. There you see the balloon run, which is in North Adams, Massachusetts. This was a dance in Arizona. I don't know where the kid was, but the whole book was full of this. We did this at C&C Offset because we found that China, by this time, was really as good as anything we could find in America for printing. And especially in uncoated paper, which was something we were always interested in. How do you print not in a coated paper, shiny paper, but a paper with no coating? This is Norman Fortier, who was the photographer of record for Buzzards Bay for years. In a little shop, if you had a Concordia, you went to the Concordia yard in Cape Now in South Dartmouth. There was Norman Fortier's little storefront. And he always had photographs, and he would photograph the New York Yacht Club race when it came through. He was really the last photographer of the wooden boats as they were disappearing, as they were being supplanted by fiberglass. And he gave his archive to the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and we did this book with New Bedford. And there you see the fleet crossing Buzzards Bay. I think that's a New York Yacht Club fleet. And this wonderful photograph of sort of the black and white sunset with the Concordia up in stays. This we did just 2 years ago with Rick Wilson, who was the curator of the Harvard Theater Collection, a wonderful guy, and who died just this year last. And McBain was probably the most important theater photographer in England between 1940 and 1960. He actually did the photographs in color for the first 3 Beatles albums. If you have, I can't remember the famous. There's one in color that's absolutely wild that McBain did. And this is McBain in his studio. He always dressed like that. And Harvard, for some reason, got this collection of 10,000 glass plates. All of the British theater for, I think we do have the book back there, for 30 years. And Rick Wilson, who was just a wonderful writer, knew everything about this, wrote the captions. And here you'll see, you know who as Richard III, warts and all. But it has Elizabeth Taylor, it has just all of the great stars of the British stage from this period. It's a real living history of what theater was like in England for 30 years. This was laying in limbo in Cambridge for 20 years. Stu Cohen had written the book and had never published it. Beacon had contracted for it and decided for whatever reason they couldn't do it. And what it is the history of the FSA, and above all, of Roy Stryker. Stryker was the man sort of at the center of the web who was sending out messages, you'll see them here, to the photographers. Ben Shawn, Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange, Sheldon Dick, Marion Post Walcott, Russell Lee, and Carl Meidens. The idea of the FSA, or at least the photography part, was to convince America, when it wasn't convinced, that poverty didn't just exist in the cities. It was a rural phenomenon. And that states like Minnesota or Arizona or Mississippi had pockets of poverty that needed federal support, federal help, just as much as the big cities did, which of course were where all the big newspapers were. So Stryker got these photographers together and basically sent them out across the country, into the countryside, with directions, which you see here. You can't read it, but he told them general notes for pictures needed for the files. This is what he needed. And he would send these photographs out for free to Time, to Life, to Look, that they could use with no permission fee to convince America that yes, we had a problem in rural areas. So small towns, this is what he wanted. Stores, outside views, front views, cars and horses and buggies, inside views, goods on shelves, people buying goods, people coming out of store with their purchases, farm machinery restraint, churches, I love this, churches on Sunday if possible. Court day, children at play with dogs. okay? Movies, men loafing under trees, local baseball games, the vacant lot, Main Street. It was all very carefully done, right down to the finances, where, you know, Walker Evans would be down there shooting Alabama, and somehow Stryker got another $30 or $40 and said, you can stay for another 3 days. Try to go to this little town 30 miles outside and get a few photographs of that. The only place they all photographed in common was New Orleans, believe it or not. And that's the last chapter of the book. I think we have, no, we don't. Okay. We've done 4 books with George Tice. This isn't my favorite, but it's the most recent. And this, he's been going to Maine for years. The Maine Photo Workshop was up there. He taught there with Arnold Newman for years and years. And we put this book together 2 years ago, printed it here in the States, as the title says, Seacoast, Maine, here being one of its great photographs of Mount Desert. You look at this and you know why the Capitol building, a lot of Boston and most of Philadelphia came from Maine granite. I mean, that lumber and coal were the 3 things that kept Maine alive during the 20th century. And this is not Vinyl Haven, it's Mount Desert. The stone is very, very similar. And this is the book we did last year. It was a great gift. This came from David Travis, and we were able to print it at Genoux, who was a great printer from Lucerne, probably the best printer we've ever worked with. And all of Karsh's books have been done in Lucerne by Genoux. So the conditions were, A, it had to be priced at $50. B, it had to be ready for the big show at the MFA and the Art Institute in Chicago. C, Sarah Eisman had to design the book. And D, I can't remember what they were. And we added it all, and it came to $135,000, I remember. So I'm sitting there with Mrs. Karsh at the Ritz, now known as the Taj, and saying, you know, we really want to do this book, but it costs more than we can really afford. So Mrs. Karsh says, wait a minute, I think I can help you. So she goes up to her room and she comes back with a check for $135,000, made out to me. Wow. No, Mrs. Karsh, that's not really what you want to do. You know, put Publisher Inc. after it. So we had a great fun to do this book, and we had a great fun doing this book. And there's one of the spreads. The wonderful thing about the book, I think, is that A, it has biographies of the people involved. It was the first time the Karsh book actually had biographies. But more important was Karsh's own take on taking the photographs. There's a great one of Churchill where he's sort of glowering at the camera, and it's the only portrait of Churchill without a cigar. And the reason he doesn't have a cigar is because as he sat there, Karsh snatched the cigar out of his hand. And of course, Churchill's looking at him like, you dare do this to me? And Casals, he tried for, I think, an hour or 2 to get a picture of Casals. Just nothing was working. And he had given up, and he was leaving this. It was an octagonal vault in a monastery where Casals loved, which he loved because of the acoustics. And he looked back, and there was the light in the dome of Casals' head. And he said, yeah, that's the decisive moment. I'll take the photograph. And the great one of Schweitzer, I think, really one of his great photographs. I think that is it. This is sort of a once-over lightly. I mean, the books are richer than you would infer from these photographs. So I encourage you to go back and look at a few of them, maybe buy them. Any questions, I would be glad to entertain. I think the really fun thing about this is that, you know, what we do is mostly print books where they just have to be read to be, you get it if you read it. Poetry, as long as you can read it, it's okay. Fiction, as long as you can read it, it's okay. But with a photographic book, the whole thing, the whole challenge, the whole substance, the whole rationale is to reproduce this difficult image as well as you can, sometimes better than the original image, believe it or not. And that's why I love doing these books. It's what makes them such fun. So thank you so much for finding me. Any questions? Yes.
You know, the Morgan Library in New York has a book collection that obviously has a very early provenance. But have you purchased anything of yours, or did you work with them?
We just published the greatest catalog in the world with the Morgan Library called Romantic Gardens, and you can buy it at the Morgan gift shop.
Have you done anything?
Yes, we've done 6 books with the Morgan, including The Art of the Printing Book with Joe Blumenthal, which went through, I think, 5 printings, which is really the best history of fine printing that's been done. The Morgan's great. I liked it better when it was called the library rather than the library in the museum. It should have stayed being a library.
What was your earliest connection with that? Because
Our earliest connection was Rick Wilson, who just died, who I mentioned, who was the great authority on Gilbert and Sullivan.
Oh, yes.
And we did a book on Gilbert and Sullivan with the Morgan Library. Believe it or not. But our best book was the one we just did this past year, Romantic Gardens, done by 2 Massachusetts authors and Elizabeth Barlow Rogers, who saved New York Park, New York Central Park. And you can get it, you can see it on the web, and it's $50. It's cheap. Really cheap. I love the Morgan. Loved it better when it was a library. Yeah.
So what's next for you?
What do we have? You know, the one I'm the most excited about, which is going to be the most challenging, it's not photography per se, but it's Michael Twyman's Definitive History of Lithography in color. It's going to be 900 pages long. It's going to be a really huge book, but it's going to cover all of lithography, because before halftones, remember what I was talking about? Halftones came in around 1870, 1880, but the way you did a photograph before that was really lithographs. And those books are absolutely beautiful, most of them hand colored. So that next year will be that and another book by Bob McLean. Yeah.
What do you see as the future of still photography?
I think it's going to be electronic. I have no question that 5 years from now we'll be printing these books maybe on demand electronically, because it's beautiful. If you see the best printing that's coming out, I mean, at places like Acton, for instance, who can do it, they are continuous tone. You can print them on archival paper. You can impose them any way you want. The only problem now is that the printing equipment really isn't big enough. The Acton's is, but most people isn't big enough so that you can print 6 up or 8 up. But when that happens, and you'll be able to say, I want 1 copy of the George Tice book, you'll get as close to the originals as you will get an offset. And I don't think I'll be around to see that, but I'm sure that that's going to be the next generation. When you think about it, it's interesting because I and people like Matthew Carter and some people sitting in this room are the last generation who will have gone from hot metal, which had been the technology of choice for 500 years, books still set in hot metal, linotype didn't make any difference, to electronic, and something done totally electronically in a space of 40 years. It's all changed. And never in the history of printing has so much change happened in so compressed a time. It's really, when you think of Matthew Carter, who in 1950 was cutting steel punches at Enschede by hand, and is now designing typefaces electronically, which you're reading in newspapers and just got a MacArthur. I mean, that's really extraordinary that one person grew up with a technology that went back to the 16th, 15th century and is now working in the 21st century in an entirely different medium, but still producing letters which are beautiful to look at. I think it's a great time to work. Yeah.
Should all this migration of printing to Malaysia and Hong Kong, you think it will come back here? It seems like
No, never come back.
No, it's just stay over there.
No. Because I think they're willing to work better for less. You know when I knew we had lost American printing? I'll just end with a story. We were doing a book called Great Camps of the Adirondacks. It was the first book we had printed abroad. And the proofs we're doing on Friday for the book. It was like 44, 45, and I was sitting at my desk. And I got a call from the vice president of something from Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan maybe, saying, "We're so sorry, Mr. Godine. We don't know what happened. We feel terrible about this. We're about to commit suicide. Your proofs are not going to get there till Monday." You know, we would never get a call like that from them. I mean, they were so embarrassed. I could feel them sweating bullets over the phone. And that's the way they work. I mean, if they say the proofs are going to be there Tuesday at noon, they're there Tuesday at noon. They can turn around the stuff. They're using very modern equipment, mostly from Germany. It's financed by the state. The state's buying and charging them very low interest. And they're good. You look at, I don't know if we have Rosalind's book back there, but that book on postcards is as beautifully printed as anything we ever did, bound in full cloth. And they can bind. That's the real difference. They can print and bind in the same operation. Okay? Well, I think there's food and drink back there. Thank you so much for coming all the way in.